Picture a small Kentucky town where neighbors borrowed sugar from one another, where church bells marked Sundays, and where children played barefoot in the dusty roads. Now imagine that same town becoming soaked in blood within just 3 years. A place where laughter was replaced by gunfire, and friendship turned into vendetta. Welcome to Rowan County, the town that forgot peace. The Rowan County War, also known as the Martin-Tolliver Feud, raged from 1884 to 1887 in the town of Morehead, Kentucky. At first glance, it might seem like just another Appalachian feud, a tale of families clashing in the mountains. But this was far more than that. This was the destruction of an entire community where personal grudges, political divisions, and the failure of law combined into one of the bloodiest conflicts in American history. It all started with two men, John Martin, Republican and respected county clerk, and Floyd Tolliver, a Democrat with family ties deep in Rowan's history. On August 1884, during what should have been an ordinary election day, tensions between the two erupted into violence. A simple argument escalated into a brutal fight, and by the end of that day, one man was dead. No one could have predicted that this single confrontation would drag the entire town into a war. The conflict didn't just emerge from nowhere. Only a few years earlier, the Underwood-Holbrook feud had ripped through Rowan County. Though that feud ended, its scars remained, fueling suspicion and resentment across families. So when Martin and Tolliver clashed, it wasn't just about them, it reawakened all those buried grudges. Old wounds that were thought to be healed suddenly began bleeding again. From that moment, Morehead's fate was sealed. The Martins rallied their Republican allies, and the Tollivers called on their Democratic supporters. The town, once united, split down the middle. In just a few weeks, streets that once echoed with hymns and laughter now rang with curses, threats, and the click of cocked pistols. Neighbors who had shared meals together suddenly stood on opposite sides of the battlefield. By the end of the feud, at least 20 men would be dead, 16 others wounded, and Morehead forever changed. Local courts were powerless, judges were corrupt, and every attempt at peace was drowned out by gunfire. Across the United States, newspapers called Morehead the bloodiest spot in Kentucky. For many, it seemed unbelievable that a small Appalachian town could spiral into such chaos so quickly. But here's the chilling truth: the Rowan County War wasn't fueled by land, money, or power. It all began with a single election day argument, and that tiny spark unleashed years of bloodshed that no one could stop. The Rowan County War wasn't just born out of politics, it was born out of a town simmering with unspoken anger. Morehead, Kentucky in the 1880s was not a quiet mountain settlement, it was a powder keg waiting for a spark. People walked the dusty streets whispering about land, elections, and honor, but underneath it all was something darker, pride that refused to bend. The seeds of the feud were planted long before the first shot was fired. Two powerful families, the Martins and the Tollivers, saw themselves as guardians of Rowan County's destiny. Each believed the county belonged to them, their influence, and their way of life. But the shocking truth was that both families were tied by blood through distant marriages, meaning every bullet fired was aimed at their own kin. The rivalry was not just personal, but political. The Democrats, led by the Tollivers, claimed the county's loyalty, while the Republicans, led by the Martins, fought to seize it. Elections turned into battles, ballots into weapons. And when words could no longer carry the weight of fury, fists, knives, and pistols replaced them. Ordinary citizens were dragged into the storm. Shopkeepers, farmers, even churchgoers found themselves choosing sides. It wasn't safe to stay neutral, silence could mean death. One man who tried to stay out of the conflict was found hanging from a tree the next morning, a chilling warning carved into his chest: choose. By 1884, Morehead wasn't just divided, it was ruled by terror. The courthouse, meant to be the heart of justice, became a battlefield. Armed men stalked its halls, turning every trial into a standoff. Mothers kept their children inside, while fathers carried rifles just to fetch water. The line between justice and revenge had vanished. Each time a Martin fell, a Tolliver had to bleed. Each time a Tolliver died, a Martin swore vengeance. But here's the twist no one saw coming: the county's law officers, the very men sworn to keep peace, were themselves divided between the two clans. The badge no longer represented justice, it represented allegiance. It wasn't just about politics anymore. It was about survival. Every sunrise in Rowan County brought fear, because no one knew who would make it to sundown. And the deeper the feud went, the more the people realized something horrifying. This wasn't a war between families anymore, it was a war against the soul of the entire town. By the summer of 1884, Rowan County was already a boiling cauldron of hatred. The election of August 1884 became the breaking point, the event that shattered whatever fragile peace still lingered in the Kentucky hills. Both the Martin and Tolliver factions gathered at the polls in Morehead, and what should have been a civic duty turned into a deadly trap. Armed men from both families roamed the streets, watching every move, their fingers twitching at their revolvers. The moment votes were cast, tension spilled into the open. A heated argument between supporters of the Martins and Tollivers quickly escalated into violence. Shots rang out across the courthouse square, echoing like thunder in the valley. Within minutes, several men lay bleeding on the ground, victims of old grudges disguised as political disputes. The ballots meant nothing, what mattered was survival. Instead of retreating after the first shots, the men fought openly in broad daylight, turning the entire election into a battlefield. The people of Rowan County were no longer spectators, they were prisoners of the feud, caught in the crossfire of family vengeance. What made this moment truly shocking was how public it was. This wasn't a midnight ambush or a backwoods skirmish, this was the middle of town, in front of wives, children, and neighbors. The brutality was on full display, and yet, no one dared intervene. Fear gripped the county so tightly that silence became the only form of survival. Local lawmen, instead of stopping the violence, chose sides, some even firing their weapons alongside the feuding families. The very people who were sworn to uphold peace had become participants in chaos, dragging the county deeper into bloodshed. By the end of that fateful day, Rowan County's fragile order was destroyed. The Martin-Tolliver feud was no longer whispered about in hushed tones, it was carved into the ground with bullets and blood. Families who had no part in the feud suddenly found themselves forced to pick a side, or risk being branded as enemies by both. Rumors spread that ballot boxes themselves had been tampered with, suggesting that the violence wasn't just about family honor, but also about controlling the county's political future. This meant the feud wasn't simply personal, it had become political warfare, a fight for dominance that extended far beyond kinship loyalty. The election day bloodbath marked the beginning of a new chapter, one where Rowan County ceased to function like any other community. Law and politics were no longer neutral, they were weapons, and the feud had just claimed them. The county had been split in two, and the road ahead promised only more blood. Hidden in the chaos, a young man from the Tolliver side allegedly switched allegiance that very night, secretly meeting with the Martins, foreshadowing betrayals that would fuel the fire in ways no one expected. They called it a political rivalry, but in Rowan County, Kentucky, in the summer of 1884, politics was only a mask for something far darker. Tension gripped the air like the heavy fog over Triplet Creek. Families aligned themselves with either the Tollivers or the Martins, and every handshake in town was measured, every look across the dusty streets carried suspicion. The courthouse no longer felt like a house of justice, it felt like a battlefield waiting for its first shot. The spark came during the county election. What should have been a day of civic duty quickly turned into a day of blood. Heated arguments over candidates spiraled into threats, and threats into fists. Then, the sound of a gunshot cracked through the air. Rowan County would never be the same again. But the shocking twist? The very first victim wasn't even a politician, it was an innocent bystander caught in the crossfire. His blood stained the ground outside the polling station, a chilling symbol that this war was no longer about ballots but bullets. From that moment, no one was safe. The Martins, furious and convinced the Tollivers orchestrated the attack, swore revenge. The Tollivers, equally enraged, claimed they were the ones provoked. The truth was twisted, reshaped, and retold until no one knew what really happened that day. Yet, behind closed doors, whispers spread that both families had actually prepared for violence long before Election Day. They had stocked weapons, gathered allies, and marked enemies. This feud had been waiting for the perfect stage, and the election gave it one. As night fell, Rowan County was plunged into chaos. Homes locked their doors, children were pulled away from windows, and men slept with rifles by their beds. The town was small, but the shadows it cast grew long and menacing. The first funeral was barely over before another killing followed, and another after that. Here's the twist no one admitted out loud: some killings were not even feud-related, they were personal grudges disguised as revenge in the war. The Rowan County War was no longer a looming threat. It had arrived, and it would not stop until the rivers of Kentucky carried away the blood of neighbors, friends, and kin. What began as a single bullet in an election dispute was about to spiral into years of terror where even the church pews and courthouse walls couldn't protect you. And the next victim? They wouldn't see it coming. The summer sun of 1884 beat down on Morehead, Kentucky, as men in dusty boots crowded around the courthouse. It wasn't just any election day, it was the one that would decide the future of Rowan County. The air carried the sharp scent of whiskey, gunpowder, and pride. Whispers darted between groups of men, each loyal to either the Martins or the Tollivers, and everyone knew this day would not end in peace. The courthouse bell tolled, and ballots were cast, but the vote wasn't about policies or progress. No, this was about power, raw, unrelenting control. The Martin faction had secured the backing of longtime families and merchants, while Craig Tolliver's growing influence came from a younger, hungrier crowd who saw him as the only man bold enough to crush the Martins' grip. But as the ballots piled high, so did the tension. A single insult was all it took to spark a fire. A Martin man muttered about Tolliver's past as a railroad detective, mocking his reputation. Tolliver's men stepped forward, fists clenching, hands drifting to revolvers. In a heartbeat, the courthouse steps erupted into chaos. Gunshots split the air. The crowd scattered, screams echoing down the narrow streets of Morehead. When the smoke cleared, several men lay wounded, their blood seeping into the dirt. But what shocked the community wasn't just the violence, it was who had pulled the triggers. The men sworn to uphold the law were the very ones emptying their pistols into the crowd. The election results were almost irrelevant. Rowan County had been baptized in blood, and the feud had crossed a point of no return. Families that once dined together now boarded up their doors at night, unsure if their neighbors were friend or foe. The courthouse, a place meant for justice, had transformed into a fortress of fear. Even worse, word spread that the sheriff himself, supposed guardian of the peace, had aligned with one faction in secret. That revelation sent shockwaves through the county. If the law could not be trusted, who could? Every man now knew he was living in a land where survival meant choosing a side, or being crushed between both. By the end of that day, the Rowan County War wasn't a whisper of tension anymore, it was a roar, a beast too large to cage. And as dusk fell, both the Martins and the Tollivers sharpened their blades and polished their rifles. The war was no longer coming. It had already arrived. The Rowan County War was no longer just whispered about in taverns or murmured in church pews, it was now being fought in broad daylight, under the shadow of the courthouse itself. This was supposed to be the place where law reigned supreme, but in Morehead, Kentucky, the courthouse became a stage for vengeance. Townsfolk gathered for trials, not out of a love for justice, but to witness the next explosion of violence. On one fateful morning in 1885, emotions ran high as the Martin faction prepared to defend their kin in court. The Tollivers, not to be outdone, arrived armed, their presence like a dark storm cloud ready to break. What was meant to be a trial of law turned into a trial of blood. Shots echoed across the square, shattering windows and sending families running for cover. Men fell where they stood, their blood staining the very steps that were meant to symbolize justice. The courthouse battle wasn't just about two feuding families anymore. It was about control of Rowan County itself. Every bullet fired was a declaration, this was not a town of law, this was a town ruled by fear. The sheriff, sworn to uphold order, was seen fleeing for his life instead of drawing his weapon. In that instant, the people realized the chilling truth, there was no law left, only survival. And yet, the violence didn't end there. Rumors whispered that behind closed doors, alliances were already shifting. Some Martins, exhausted by the endless cycle of death, secretly approached Tolliver men under the cover of night, seeking to strike their own bargains. Enemies became allies in the shadows, while supposed brothers plotted betrayal at the dinner table. The feud was no longer black and white, it was a spider's web of deceit, trust breaking apart strand by strand. By the time the smoke cleared at the courthouse steps, Morehead was left with more coffins than verdicts. But the blood spilled that day only set the stage for darker days ahead. The feud had crossed a line it could never retreat from. The air in the hollow was thick that night, a silence so heavy it pressed against the skin like damp cloth. Locals whispered that once you crossed the tree line of Buckhorn Ridge, you entered a place where time didn't move the same way. Every hunter who dared to track game beyond that ridge spoke of shadows that lingered too long, footsteps that followed too close. And yet, that was exactly where Ezekiel chose to take them, his new converts, frightened yet desperate for belonging. At first, they thought the gathering was a simple prayer circle. A fire crackled in the center, throwing sparks against the blackened sky. Ezekiel's voice cut through the night like steel, promising salvation, promising freedom from sins they hadn't even known they carried. But then something shifted. He began asking them to renounce not just their pasts, but their families, their homes, everything that tethered them to the world outside his reach. That was the first time one of them hesitated, and Ezekiel's smile froze. The boy, no older than 17, glanced back toward the path they had come. The firelight flickered across his face, and for the first time, someone else saw it too, the doubt, the fracture. Ezekiel's hand shot out, gripping the boy's shoulder with unnatural force. In that moment, the crowd realized Ezekiel wasn't just leading prayers, he was testing loyalty. Those who faltered would not be forgiven. The silence broke with a scream. No one saw exactly what Ezekiel did, only that the boy collapsed, his body twitching in the dirt as if the earth itself had swallowed him whole. The others froze, terror rooting them in place. But Ezekiel only turned back to the group, his voice eerily calm. Doubt, he said, is the only true enemy. And then, as though nothing had happened, he ordered them to kneel. The night deepened. From the tree line came a rustle, too heavy for wind, too deliberate for animals. Some swore they saw shapes moving, pale outlines between the trees, watching. Ezekiel never turned his head, but his eyes gleamed with knowledge. That was when they realized, he wasn't afraid of what lurked in the woods, because whatever it was, it served him. Knees hit the ground. Faces pressed into the dirt. And above them all, Ezekiel raised his hands to the sky as though he could command the stars themselves. For those who survived that night, the memory never faded. They said it wasn't the fire, or the screams, or even the shadows that haunted them most. It was the way Ezekiel's followers obeyed, not out of faith, but out of fear that if they didn't, they would vanish just like the boy. The Rowan County War was already a storm of blood and revenge, but nothing could have prepared the people of Morehead for the betrayal that came next. At first glance, the feud had clear sides, the Tollivers, backed by their Democratic allies, and the Martins, supported by Republicans. Yet in the shadows, loyalties were shifting, and whispers of treachery echoed through the hills. A man who once swore his loyalty to the Tollivers suddenly crossed enemy lines. His name was whispered in backrooms, a former ally turned informer. But here's the twist, he wasn't just betraying the Tollivers, he was secretly manipulating the Martins as well. Like a snake coiled between two fires, he fed lies to both sides, turning suspicion into paranoia. The result? Every handshake became suspect, every glance a possible threat. Trust evaporated in Rowan County. Even family members began to doubt each other, fearing someone within their own bloodline might be the next to switch sides. In a land where honor and kinship were everything, this was the ultimate poison. The betrayal sparked a chain reaction of violence. Meetings that were meant for truce ended in gunfire. Letters carried false promises of peace, only to lure men into ambushes. And yet, the people of Morehead didn't know the full truth, that their entire war was being stoked by someone who thrived in chaos. Some accounts claimed this traitor wasn't acting alone but was working under the influence of powerful outsiders who wanted Rowan County to burn, for profit and for power. Suddenly, the feud wasn't just local anymore, it was tied to unseen hands pulling strings from afar. The war had begun as a fight between two families, but by this point, it had mutated into something far darker. Now no one could be sure whether they were fighting for justice, for revenge, or merely for the amusement of hidden puppet masters. And that uncertainty would only lead Rowan County deeper into madness. But the worst was yet to come. Because when the war moved from whispered betrayal to open massacre, Rowan County's streets would run red with blood. The sun barely rose over Morehead when rumors of an ambush spread like wildfire. The Martins had received word that a small group of Tolliver men planned to cross Buckhorn Ridge to confront them. Every horse clip-clopped against the dirt roads like a countdown to disaster. Families peered through shuttered windows, praying that this day wouldn't be the one that claimed more lives. The ridge was a treacherous stretch of land, dense forest, steep cliffs, and hidden hollows perfect for anyone planning an attack. The Martins rode out, rifles ready, hearts pounding. Unbeknownst to them, someone from within their own camp had leaked their route to the Tollivers. The trap was already set. As the Martins crested the ridge, gunfire erupted from hidden positions. Men fell instantly, their screams echoing through the forest. Panic set in. Horses reared and bucked. And the Martins were forced to retreat, but not all could escape. In the chaos, a young Tolliver fighter switched sides mid-battle, saving a Martin officer he barely knew, revealing the war wasn't just black and white anymore. The skirmish left bodies scattered across the ridge, blood soaking the leaves and dirt. News of the ambush reached Morehead by evening, causing waves of terror in the town. Rumors spread that a local merchant had profited by secretly supplying both sides with weapons and ammunition, turning human lives into currency. The war wasn't just about honor or politics, it had become a business of blood. By nightfall, the ridge was quiet, but the damage was done. Families mourned, alliances shifted, and the line between friend and foe blurred beyond recognition. Every shadow seemed like a potential assassin, every knock on the door a threat. Some claimed that a hidden Tolliver scout had infiltrated the Martins' home that night, leaving behind a symbol, a skull carved into the doorway, as a warning of the next strike. Rowan County was changing. What began as a feud between two families had mutated into a war of paranoia, deception, and survival. The ridge had become a grim reminder, in this conflict, no one was truly safe, and even victory could bring death. And yet, as Morehead slept that night, the real horror was not on the ridge, it was in the shadows of the town, where betrayal and murder were plotting their next move. The summer of 1885 in Rowan County was suffocating, not just with heat, but with tension that had reached a boiling point. Both the Martin and Tolliver factions had been arming themselves, patrolling the streets of Morehead as if preparing for a battlefield. Neutral citizens lived in fear, whispering that one spark could ignite an inferno. That spark came on a dusty afternoon when a chance encounter escalated into a deadly clash. Richard Martin, a cousin of the Martin leader, crossed paths with Floyd Tolliver's men outside a general store. What started as sharp words quickly turned into drawn pistols. The gunfire rang out across the quiet town like thunder, leaving two men dead before the smoke cleared. But here's the twist, neither of the dead belonged to the original argument. Innocent bystanders were the first to pay the price. This single exchange ripped away the illusion that the feud might resolve without large-scale bloodshed. The town's silence ended, replaced with the sound of gunfire echoing more frequently than church bells. Families rushed to barricade themselves indoors, while both sides claimed the skirmish was the other's fault. The Martins argued that Tolliver's men were the aggressors, yet evidence suggested Richard Martin had drawn his weapon first. The paranoia grew. Every public gathering felt like a potential ambush. A wedding turned into a tense standoff when men from both sides attended armed, glaring across the pews, waiting for the smallest excuse to start firing. Even funerals became dangerous, as one faction feared the other would use the grief of the moment as cover for revenge. One chilling rumor spread, some men were said to be digging graves in advance, knowing more killings were inevitable. By the end of that week, Rowan County had transformed into a place where life meant carrying a gun at all times and trusting no one. The war was no longer whispers of bad blood, it was a rolling storm of vengeance that promised no safe harbor. The Rowan County War wasn't just bullets and ambushes, it was a test of how far loyalty could push men into darkness. By the time 1886 rolled around, the county was so poisoned with suspicion that neighbors stopped greeting each other on the road. A handshake could hide a pistol, and a friendly nod could mean betrayal. Fear wasn't in the shadows anymore, it lived in broad daylight. And the most dangerous part? Sometimes the men who swore they were on your side were the ones secretly plotting your downfall. The Tolliver faction had started to grow restless. Frank Martin's men had been quieter, more calculated, and some Tolliver allies began whispering that maybe Craig Tolliver wasn't the leader they thought he was. That paranoia made him more dangerous. He tightened his grip on Morehead, issuing orders like a warlord, and demanded absolute loyalty. But in tightening his fist, he didn't realize some of his closest supporters were already slipping away, secretly negotiating with the other side. As the feud spiraled, even law enforcement became a game of masks. The sheriff's badge meant nothing. Half the time, it was worn by a man whose allegiances switched depending on who offered him more power. Rowan County was a town of shifting alliances, where every man had two faces and every promise came with a knife behind it. The shocking truth was this: sometimes the difference between a friend and an enemy was nothing more than the space of a single bullet. By this point, the feud had swallowed nearly every corner of life. Families were divided, farms abandoned, and schools shut down. Morehead was less a town than a powder keg waiting for a single spark. Everyone knew it was coming, but no one dared say it out loud. The Rowan County War wasn't cooling down, it was sharpening into something far worse. And Craig Tolliver, obsessed with control, was about to learn the deadliest lesson of all: in a world where everyone plays both sides, the strongest man isn't the one holding the most guns, it's the one who sees betrayal before it strikes. The Rowan County courthouse was supposed to be the one place where law and order still held meaning. But in 1885, during the height of the war, the courthouse turned into a slaughterhouse. The trial of one of Floyd Tolliver's allies had drawn both factions into the same room, and tension filled the air like gunpowder waiting for a spark. Citizens crammed onto wooden benches, judges whispered nervously, and armed men lined the walls. Everyone knew this trial was not about justice, it was about survival. The judge read charges, voices muttered, and then suddenly an insult rang out from the back benches. No one remembers exactly what was said, but it was enough to rip the thin veil of civility apart. Within seconds, pistols were drawn. A shot thundered through the chamber, echoing against the high ceiling. People screamed, diving for cover as the Tollivers and the Martins turned the courtroom into a battlefield. The very man on trial, instead of defending himself legally, drew his own pistol and fired the first shot. The defendant had become the executioner. Gunpowder smoke choked the room, and wooden panels splintered under flying lead. Even the judge, who tried to restore order with his gavel, ducked beneath the bench as bullets ricocheted around him. Several men fell, bleeding onto the polished oak floorboards, their cries drowned out by the chaos. The once sacred hall of justice was now stained red. When the smoke cleared, one of the men dead on the ground was not from either faction, it was an innocent townsman who had simply come to watch. His murder proved that this feud had spread beyond family honor. Now, the whole county was hostage to their war. Outside, women screamed as the wounded were dragged into the sunlight. Families wept, and whispers spread that Rowan County was cursed. No one could believe the courthouse, the symbol of order, had become the most violent scene of all. For the Martins, the bloodbath was proof the Tollivers had no respect for law. For the Tollivers, it was proof the Martins had rigged the system against them. In the aftermath, both factions swore vengeance, but neither admitted that their own men had killed innocents that day. Each side blamed the other, fueling the fire higher. The courthouse massacre shocked Kentucky. Newspapers across the state carried headlines about Rowan County descending into lawlessness. But instead of bringing shame that might have cooled the feud, the reports only spread the legend. The Martins and Tollivers now fought not just for dominance, but for pride, their names etched into a story of blood. The war was no longer a family dispute. It was now a rebellion against order itself, and Rowan County was bleeding from the inside out. The Rowan County War was no longer just about personal grudges, it had become a chessboard of shifting alliances, where every handshake could turn into a death sentence. The air in Morehead grew so tense that even the most innocent glance across the street could ignite suspicions of treachery. Families who once lived as neighbors now treated each other as spies, whispering behind closed doors and gripping rifles under their tables. No one expected the very leaders of both sides to begin questioning their own allies. Rumors spread like wildfire that some Tolliver men were secretly in talks with the Martins, while whispers claimed that a few of Martin's own kin were pocketing bribes to stay silent. Suddenly, the lines of loyalty began to blur, and the once clear-cut feud dissolved into a fog of doubt and betrayal. A Tolliver cousin was discovered dead in the woods, not killed by a Martin, but by one of his own supposed allies. The official story claimed it was an accident, a drunken stumble into violence, but few in Rowan County believed that. Instead, the death marked a turning point. No one could be sure if their worst enemy lived across the field or sat beside them at the supper table. The Martins, sensing the cracks in the Tolliver ranks, moved quickly. Richard Martin began spreading secret messages through sympathizers in town, painting Floyd Tolliver's men as unstable and untrustworthy. And it worked. Merchants started refusing credit to Tolliver supporters, leaving many of them struggling to feed their families. Even as Richard Martin's strategy succeeded, one of his most trusted lieutenants was caught meeting with a Tolliver sympathizer at night. The betrayal cut like a knife. Was the feud collapsing into chaos, or was it evolving into something even darker, a war where no loyalty could be trusted? Meanwhile, ordinary citizens begged for peace, but their voices were drowned beneath the crack of gunfire. Morehead, once a thriving community, was now a ghost town where every step down Main Street felt like walking into an ambush. Children were kept indoors, schools emptied, and church pews sat half-filled, as if God himself had been driven away by the feud's unholy grip. The most shocking rumor of all was whispered in taverns, that someone inside the county courthouse was secretly fueling the conflict, tipping off both sides for personal gain. If true, it meant the war wasn't just family against family, it was being orchestrated like a puppet show by unseen hands. And that left Rowan County facing an even greater question: was the feud really about vengeance anymore, or had it become a game of power so corrupt that no one would survive with their soul intact? By the autumn of 1885, Rowan County had become a place where trust could kill you. People whispered that even sharing a drink could be a death sentence. The feud wasn't just fought with bullets anymore, it seeped into the very food and drink of the townsfolk. Rumors spread of poisoned whiskey being passed around at taverns, of meals laced with toxins, of enemies striking not in broad daylight but in the shadows of supper tables. And then, one night, a man collapsed mid-sentence, clutching his throat, after drinking from a glass handed to him by a supposed friend. The lines between loyalty and betrayal blurred further. Families who once broke bread together now eyed each other with suspicion, fearful that even kin might be plotting their downfall. The feud had poisoned not just the land, but the spirit of Morehead itself. The man who collapsed that night wasn't the intended target, his death was a chilling accident. The real victim, it turned out, was sitting just a few seats away. This mistake sent shockwaves through both sides of the feud. If fate could twist a hand like that, if death could fall upon the wrong man at the wrong moment, then no one was truly safe. Every sip, every bite, every handshake became a gamble. When the poisoned man was laid to rest, mourners noticed his coffin guarded not by family, but by men from the rival clan. Whispers said they had killed the wrong man and now watched his grave out of shame, or fear that his spirit would rise for revenge. The poison chalice marked a turning point in the Rowan County War. Violence was no longer only about gunfire in the streets, it was about dread woven into daily life. The feud had crossed into a darker, more insidious realm, where even survival itself felt like a cruel accident. Rowan County was no longer just a community, it was a battlefield. By 1886, the feud between the Tolliver and Martin factions had stretched into a full-scale war, leaving behind a trail of widows, orphans, and burned homes. But just when people thought the violence might burn itself out, a single spark reignited the fire. That spark came when Craig Tolliver, the iron-fisted leader of his clan, heard whispers that his enemies were regrouping in the shadows. For months, both sides had exchanged sporadic gunfire, but the whispers spoke of something far more sinister, a planned ambush designed to end Craig's reign once and for all. Craig, suspicious of even his own allies, began tightening his grip on Morehead. No one entered, no one left without his men's approval. It was less a town now and more a fortress. But here's the twist, some of Craig's most trusted men were secretly passing information to the Martins. They smiled in his presence, but at night, they carried whispers through back roads and hollow trails, feeding his enemies just enough knowledge to keep the blood flowing. As paranoia grew, Craig's justice became harsher. Suspected traitors were beaten or run out of town, their homes set ablaze as a warning. But instead of breaking the opposition, these acts fueled it. Families who had once tried to remain neutral were forced to choose sides, either bend to Craig's law or stand against him. And every choice brought fresh blood to the ground. The Martins, waiting for the right moment, used Craig's paranoia to their advantage. While he was busy policing his own men, they plotted in silence, gathering allies from outside Rowan County. Their plan was patient, deliberate, and designed to strike when Craig least expected it. And then, the unthinkable happened. A Martin sympathizer inside Craig's own camp handed over details of his movements, setting the stage for one of the bloodiest clashes in Rowan County history. The fire wasn't dying. It was only getting hotter. By the spring of 1886, Rowan County had become a battlefield with no end in sight. Entire families avoided stepping outside after sundown, schools shut their doors, and merchants boarded up their shops as if preparing for a hurricane. Only this storm wasn't of nature's making, it was forged by neighbors turning rifles on neighbors. The feud had grown so violent that it began to ripple far beyond Kentucky. Newspapers across the nation printed headlines about the Rowan County War, calling it one of the bloodiest private conflicts in America's history. Politicians could no longer ignore it. That was when Governor J. Proctor Knott finally stepped in. At first, he believed a show of force would be enough. He deployed state militia into Morehead, expecting the sight of uniforms and rifles to silence the fighting. But Rowan County was unlike any other place. These men weren't afraid of soldiers. Many had fought in the Civil War, hardened by years of bloodshed. Instead of backing down, they saw the militia as just another enemy to outwit. The governor's attempt at peace only gave both sides a common target, outsiders sent to control them. For a brief moment, it seemed as though Knott might achieve what no one else had, a truce. He appointed local mediators to broker a peace deal, urging both Tolliver and Martin men to lay down their arms. Families desperate for normal life begged their leaders to accept. But desperation rarely overpowers pride. Just days after signing, the so-called peace agreement was shattered when a Martin supporter was gunned down outside a courthouse, the ink on the treaty barely dry. Each attempt at resolution only deepened the distrust. Some claimed the governor secretly favored the Tollivers, others whispered he leaned toward the Martins. Truth hardly mattered anymore. Suspicion alone was enough to restart the bloodshed. One night, a rumor spread that Governor Knott planned to permanently station militia in Rowan County. By morning, 5 armed men lay dead on the roadside, killed for being mistaken as state informants. By now, the war was no longer just about land, law, or even personal vendettas. It had become a battle for dominance, a question of whether Rowan County could ever be governed by law again, or whether it would remain forever ruled by the gun. And behind every failed negotiation, every hollow promise of peace, one truth grew sharper: in Rowan County, reconciliation was dead. But if the governor's power couldn't tame the feud, what force could? The answer would come not from politics or soldiers, but from something far darker, a betrayal so personal it would leave even hardened fighters stunned. The fire had raged for hours, turning the once proud homestead into a smoldering skeleton of ash and ruin. But as dawn broke, the townspeople stumbled upon something they never expected. Among the blackened ruins, there was movement, a single figure crawling from the wreckage, covered in soot but very much alive. The one everyone thought had perished in the flames was still breathing. Whispers erupted instantly. Who had survived? Was it fate, or was it part of a plan carefully hidden all along? The survivors' eyes carried a story more terrifying than the fire itself. They had seen what really happened in the final minutes before the blaze consumed everything. But instead of relief, the survivors' return filled the air with dread, for their truth threatened to rip apart the fragile lies the town had built. The fire, it seemed, was no accident, it was a cover-up. The sheriff stood frozen, staring at the survivor as if he'd seen a ghost. His face drained of color, and for the first time, the people realized that he wasn't just another victim of circumstance. He knew more than he had ever confessed. The sheriff wasn't trying to solve the mystery, he was trying to bury it. As the survivor tried to speak, their voice cracked, but the words were sharp enough to cut through the silence. It wasn't the flames that tried to kill me, it was someone in this town. The crowd recoiled, suspicion scattering like sparks in the wind. Neighbors looked at neighbors, friends questioned friends. The trust that had held this community together began to collapse. The greatest danger wasn't the fire, it was standing right among them. And then came the most chilling revelation of all. From the ruins, a small chest was pulled out, miraculously intact. Inside were records, names, dates, and cryptic notes written in hurried, almost desperate handwriting. These weren't just family papers, they were a ledger of secrets, a hidden record of debts, betrayals, and deaths spanning decades. The survivor had risked everything to bring it out. And now, the chest threatened to expose not just one guilty hand, but an entire network of conspirators who had thrived in silence for generations. The crowd held its breath, waiting for the sheriff to seize the chest. But he didn't move. Instead, he whispered words no one was prepared for: "If you open that box, none of us will ever be safe again." The deeper investigators dug, the stranger the story became. What was once thought to be a tale of poverty and desperation started looking more like a meticulously crafted system designed to keep people trapped. Records unearthed from the county courthouse showed an unusual pattern: land deeds that seemed to circle back to the same names, properties sold for pennies, and then mysteriously reclaimed within a few years. It wasn't random. It was deliberate. But here's the terrifying truth: the very land people worked on for generations may never have truly belonged to them at all. Witnesses began recalling unsettling details. Families swore they had signed papers proving ownership, only to be told decades later those papers never existed. Others remembered visits from shadowy men who offered help during tough harvest seasons, but that help came with fine print, loans so predatory they swallowed entire farms. One farmer confessed that the signature on his land transfer wasn't even his own, he had been illiterate and someone had signed it for him. And then came the whispers about a ledger. A book that supposedly listed every farm, every debt, and every name tied into the web. Some said it was hidden in the church basement, others claimed it had been buried with a local official who died suddenly. But if the ledger truly existed, it meant someone had been keeping track of this corruption for decades. When investigators tried to track down the rumored ledger, they discovered that every person who claimed to have seen it either disappeared or refused to speak again. The town that once looked ordinary was starting to look like the stage for one of the greatest land scams in American history. And the deeper we go, the more chilling the truth becomes. By now, what looked like scattered rumors had solidified into something darker, an organized system of control. Investigators noticed that anyone who tried to challenge the land deals, anyone who dared to bring their case to court, met the same fate: humiliation, bankruptcy, or silence. It was as if an invisible hand was rewriting justice itself, erasing voices before they could even speak. Court transcripts revealed something almost unbelievable. Judges who presided over property disputes had family ties to the very land barons accused of fraud. In some cases, their signatures appeared on the contested deeds themselves. It wasn't justice, it was theater. The gavel was just another weapon used to cement control. One shocking discovery showed that a clerk had been altering legal documents by hand, changing dates and ownership details, to make it look like the land never belonged to the farmers at all. And then came the chilling testimonies. Families recalled receiving anonymous threats, warning them not to fight. Doors rattled in the night. Livestock went missing. Barns mysteriously caught fire. The message was clear: resist, and you'd lose more than just land. In one case, a man who had gathered enough evidence to expose the fraud was found drowned in a shallow creek, his briefcase full of documents gone without a trace. The town wasn't just dealing with shady contracts. It was dealing with an entire machinery of fear, where the courthouse, the church, and even the sheriff's office seemed to move in lockstep. And the deeper the pattern stretched, the more it felt like this wasn't just one town's curse, it was a model used across the Appalachian frontier. The ledger, an ordinary-looking, leather-bound book, suddenly became the single most dangerous object in the county. Inside it were names, dates, and payments that tied judges, sheriffs, and land barons together in a web of corruption. Whoever held it could either expose the entire system, or vanish like those before them. The moment the ledger was discovered, the countdown began, because everyone who wanted it for very different reasons. The man who stumbled upon it wasn't a lawyer or politician, he was a coal miner's son, searching through his late father's belongings. Tucked under the floorboards, wrapped in oilcloth, was the book that shouldn't have existed. At first, he didn't even understand what he had. But once he flipped through the names, judges he'd seen in court, sheriffs he'd watched riding through town, his blood ran cold. Within 48 hours of finding it, strangers began following him. Lamps flickered out in his home. His barn was burned to the ground. The message was unmistakable, "We know you have it." But he didn't hide. He copied pages, sending them secretly to trusted friends. Every copy was a weapon, a time bomb ticking louder with each day. For the first time in decades, the system had a crack. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the man disappeared. Some say he fled into the mountains, others swear his body was dumped in an abandoned mine. But the ledger itself? It was never recovered. Only fragments, scattered testimonies, charred pages, and whispers remained. And here's where the story twists even darker. Decades later, when researchers retraced the events, they found nearly identical stories in other Appalachian counties: farmers, miners, ordinary men stumbling into evidence, only to vanish. This wasn't a single conspiracy. It was a network. The winter of 1891 hit Appalachia harder than anyone could remember. Snow piled up like walls, sealing cabins, barns, and roads beneath a suffocating white silence. Families who had barely survived the previous years now faced something much darker than hunger, an enemy that could not be seen, only felt. At first, it was whispered about in hushed tones: livestock collapsing without wounds, food rotting overnight, and men waking up with their faces pale and lips trembling as though frozen from the inside. But soon, whispers turned into cries. The sickness spread like wildfire, stripping the strongest men of their strength, leaving women helpless, and children gasping in their sleep. Some said it was a plague. Others swore it was a curse sent by the land itself. Yet the most terrifying suspicion of all came from those who dared to speak the unthinkable. What if someone had unleashed this deliberately? A traveling preacher arrived at one of the villages, promising deliverance. He claimed that prayer alone could protect them, and desperate families gathered in the bitter cold to chant and beg for salvation. But as night fell, the preacher vanished, leaving behind a trail of footprints that led not to the forest, but directly toward the Weatherstone property. And when villagers later searched his abandoned room, they found pages torn from his Bible, scribbled over with strange sigils and maps of the surrounding valleys. As weeks dragged on, the mountain people faced a choice: wait and die in silence, or take action. Rumors spread that hidden in the caves near Weatherstone's land were crates of strange powders and tinctures, chemicals no farmer should have had access to. A young boy swore he saw men hauling barrels at night, their lanterns dimmed, their faces wrapped in cloth. The chilling twist? That very same boy vanished the next day, his bed found neatly made as if he had simply risen and walked into the snow. By February, the death toll could no longer be ignored. Dozens had perished, entire families wiped out in less than a week. The local doctor, who had first dismissed the plague as mere pneumonia, suddenly disappeared without leaving a single trace. And yet, those who dared to question aloud whether the Weatherstones were behind this horror soon found themselves struck with the very same illness they accused the family of spreading. It was no longer just a feud, nor just survival. This was war against something no one could fully name. And the mountains, once a place of shelter, had become a prison where the walls of snow hid secrets far more terrifying than the sickness itself. And the greatest twist? When the thaw finally came, dozens of shallow graves were discovered near the river, but none of them held bodies. The winter of 1888 was one of the harshest the Appalachian Mountains had seen in decades. Snow buried entire cabins, roads turned into icy death traps, and families huddled in silence by dying fires. But while the mountains seemed frozen in stillness, the feud between the Hatfields and McCoys burned hotter than ever. And on one storm-bitten night, an event occurred that would once again shock the nation. It began with a single shot, echoing across the Tug Fork Valley like thunder splitting the Night sky. Within minutes, lanterns were lit, rifles were loaded, and whispers turned into screams. Who fired that first shot? Some said it was a McCoy sentry guarding their cabin. Others swore it was a Hatfield hunting in the woods. But the truth was far darker, because the shot wasn't random. It was bait. As the families scrambled for cover, a shadowed group of riders emerged from the tree line, their faces hidden, their rifles glinting under the moonlight. They weren't there to fight. They were there to lure. And like moths drawn to flame, the McCoys fell for it. By the time they realized it was an ambush, it was already too late. But here's where the story takes it. When the smoke cleared and bodies lay scattered, some of the attackers were found not to be Hatfields at all. They were hired guns, mercenaries from outside the valley. Which raised one chilling question: who brought them in? The feud had always been about blood and land, about honor and vengeance. But this revelation hinted at something more sinister. If outsiders were now involved, was the feud still about family pride, or had it become something larger, a weapon in the hands of those who wanted chaos in the mountains? And then came the one of the fallen attackers carried a letter in his coat. It wasn't signed, but it bore a symbol, an emblem scratched into the parchment, an emblem witnesses claimed matched the seal of a powerful coal company seeking to control land on both sides of the Tug Fork. Suddenly, the feud didn't look like a personal vendetta anymore. It looked like a chessboard. But the most haunting part? Neither family ever admitted to hiring the mercenaries. Which means this battle might have been orchestrated by forces neither the Hatfields nor the McCoys fully understood. The feud was no longer just a storm between two families. It had become a storm swallowing everyone in its path. The day the court doors finally opened for the Hatfields and McCoys, the nation was watching. What began as a family grudge over a pig had now escalated into a courtroom drama that would decide not just guilt and innocence, but the future of an entire region. Reporters filled the benches, sketching every glare, every whisper, every clenched fist between the two clans. This wasn't just justice on trial, it was pride, revenge, and survival. The McCoys demanded justice for the years of blood spilled, pointing directly at Devil and Hatfield as the mastermind behind the violence. Witnesses trembled as they gave testimony, some too scared to speak the truth. One key witness suddenly changed his story on the stand, shocking everyone. Was it fear of retaliation, or a bribe whispered in the shadows? For the Hatfields, the courtroom was enemy territory. They argued that the McCoys exaggerated, twisted, and manipulated the law for vengeance. The defense painted themselves not as cold-blooded killers, but as protectors of their own, men forced into war because the McCoys refused to let go of hatred. Letters surfaced during the trial suggesting that certain lawmen had sided with the McCoys for political gain. Suddenly, the question was no longer just, who killed who, but, who was pulling the strings? The tension inside the courthouse was unbearable. Every verdict, every sentence carried the weight of decades of feuding. When the first guilty verdict rang out, gasps shook the room. A Hatfield would hang. The feud that had begun in backwoods fields was now being ended by the noose of the law. Just before sentencing, a juror admitted he had been threatened by an unknown rider outside his home. Was the trial itself corrupted, or was this the only way the feud could ever end? But here's the chilling: as the Hatfields were marched away in chains, some whispered that justice had only silenced the feud on paper. In the dark mountains of Appalachia, grudges don't vanish with a gavel strike. They linger. They wait. They grow. The storm outside had finally calmed, but inside the Weatherstone farmhouse, the storm was only beginning. Lanterns flickered against the wooden walls, casting long shadows that seemed to move on their own. It was past midnight when a loud knock rattled the door. Everyone froze. The knock came again, slow, deliberate, heavy, as if whoever stood outside wanted them to know they weren't leaving. Ezekiel signaled silence, but in that silence, the tension thickened. No one breathed. Then, the door creaked open on its own, though no one had touched it. What if the one person they feared most was already inside? At first, they thought it was the wind, but then a figure stepped into the room. It wasn't a stranger. It was Silas, Ezekiel's own brother, who everyone believed had died months earlier. His face was pale, his clothes torn, his eyes hollow. He looked like he had clawed his way back from the grave itself. He staggered forward, muttering words no one could understand, before collapsing in the middle of the floor. The family rushed to him, torn between fear and recognition. Ezekiel didn't move. He simply stared at Silas with an expression that wasn't surprise, it was rage. He whispered, "You weren't supposed to come back." Silas hadn't died, he had been buried alive. As Silas regained strength, he told his story in broken gasps. He had been punished for questioning Ezekiel's rule, locked inside a coffin and buried in the woods. But somehow, he clawed his way out and survived. His sudden return split the family apart. Some saw him as a ghost, others as proof that Ezekiel's cruelty knew no limits. Ezekiel, furious, tried to silence him. But the more he spoke, the more secrets spilled. Silas revealed that Ezekiel had been making deals with outsiders, selling off family members for money, land, and power. That wasn't loyalty, it was betrayal. The feared leader wasn't protecting the family at all, he was trading them like cattle. The revelation turned the room into chaos. Murmurs grew into shouts, shouts into threats. For the first time in decades, Ezekiel's control cracked. The lanterns flickered again, as if the farmhouse itself was holding its breath. Then, in the middle of the shouting, Silas looked Ezekiel straight in the eyes and said, "I wasn't the only one you buried." The room fell silent. There were more graves in the woods, and they weren't empty. Everyone froze. The storm outside picked up once more, as though nature itself wanted to expose the truth. And for the first time, the family realized that the enemy they feared had been sitting at their own table all along. The town believed they had finally escaped the storm, that the shadows of the farm had been buried with the arrests and the silence of the fields. But evil never dies quietly, it lingers, waiting for a chance to breathe again. In 1971, almost a decade after Ezekiel was taken away, a group of teenagers dared each other to break into the abandoned barn. The floorboards were rotten, the air choked with dust, but what they found carved into the wooden beams made their blood run cold. Dozens of names. Names of people from the town who had gone missing. Names that weren't in police files. Names that shouldn't have been there. And here's the one of the names carved deep into the wood was of a man who was still alive, living quietly in town. When confronted, he turned pale and refused to speak. Locking himself inside his house for weeks. No one ever knew why his name was there, or if Ezekiel had marked him for something yet to come. The authorities dismissed the carvings as the ramblings of a madman, but the town wasn't so sure anymore. Rumors spread of survivors who were never found because they didn't want to be, of hidden tunnels beneath the farm that connected to caves stretching for miles. If that was true, then the raid in the 1960s hadn't ended anything. It had only scratched the surface. As whispers grew louder, another discovery turned the town's fear into terror. Buried beneath a collapsed shed, locals unearthed dozens of small glass jars sealed with wax. Inside each one was something unspeakable, tufts of hair, teeth, even tiny bones. It was as if Ezekiel had been collecting trophies, preserving pieces of his victims like a twisted archive. Some of the hair samples didn't belong to anyone known from that era. DNA analysis decades later revealed something terrifying: they belonged to people who went missing long after Ezekiel was gone. The town could no longer comfort itself with the illusion that evil had been vanquished. Instead, a darker question loomed over every whispered conversation: had Ezekiel truly worked alone? Or had his disciples carried on his rituals in the shadows, long after his arrest? Because if the jars proved anything, it was this: the horror of the farm wasn't a chapter in history, it was an unbroken chain. And someone, somewhere, was making sure it continued. The air was thick with silence, the kind of silence that feels alive, crawling across your skin like invisible insects. The mine shaft, once roaring with the sound of pickaxes and laughter, was now a tomb of whispers. The rescue team had expected collapsed beams and broken rocks. But what they found instead was something no training manual could prepare them for. Buried deep inside the mountain, the miners had left behind something more terrifying than death itself, a message carved into stone that would haunt everyone who read it. At first glance, it looked like frantic scratches, the kind of marks desperate men would make when oxygen runs low. But as the lantern light spread across the wall, the scratches formed words, clear, deliberate, and chilling. The inscription read, "We were not alone down here." The rescuers thought it was just fear talking, the delusions of men trapped in darkness. But then they found handprints, small ones. Too small to belong to any of the miners. The deeper they went, the stranger it became. Food supplies had been scattered, untouched. Helmets lay in perfect rows, as if someone, or something, had carefully placed them there. It wasn't chaos. It was ritual. The rescuers could feel the mountain watching, every sound echoing back with unnatural weight. And then came the discovery that turned fear into terror. At the farthest chamber, they found a circle of stones arranged like an altar. On top of it lay a bundle of cloth, weathered and torn. When one rescuer unwrapped it, expecting bones or tools, he staggered back. Inside was a child's toy, a wooden doll, carved decades before the mine had even been built. The mine had opened in 1912. That doll? It dated back to the 1800s. The men's nerves shattered. Radios crackled with panic as the team debated leaving immediately, but orders were orders, continue the search. And so they pushed further into the black, every footstep heavier than the last. That's when one of them noticed it, drip, drip, drip. Not water. Blood. Trickling down from the ceiling onto their helmets. They shined their lights upward, expecting injured bats or debris. But what they saw froze them in place. Hanging from the jagged rock were ropes. And tied to those ropes were bones, human bones, swaying ever so slightly, as if moved by unseen hands. Some bones were still fresh. Flesh clung to them. Which meant they hadn't been there for decades. Someone, or something, was still down here. The team's leader barked an order to retreat. But before they could even turn back, the tunnel behind them collapsed. The mountain had sealed them in. And in the silence that followed, a voice echoed through the shaft. It wasn't the voice of a rescuer. It wasn't the voice of a miner. It was the voice of a child. They thought the storm was over, but in truth, it was only the eye of the hurricane. The town had begun to rebuild, boards nailed across broken windows, prayers whispered in half-burnt churches, and laughter hesitantly returning to the streets. For the first time in decades, people believed the shadows were gone. But shadows do not die so easily, they linger, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. It started small, almost invisible. A family's chickens went missing one night. A week later, an old well, sealed for generations, was found open, its rope freshly frayed. No one spoke of it out loud, but the same fear that once paralyzed the town began to crawl back under their skin. One morning, a farmer discovered a set of footprints in the mud behind his barn, too large for a child, too light for a man. They led nowhere, as though the creature that left them had simply vanished into thin air. When he showed them to the sheriff, the prints had already disappeared overnight, washed away not by rain but by something darker. By midsummer, whispers spread faster than wildfire. Children swore they heard humming in the woods, the same melody their grandparents had once forbidden them from singing. Women swore they saw figures staring from the ridge at dusk, their eyes reflecting light like an animal's. The old were the first to recognize it, the curse wasn't gone. It had only been waiting. A young boy, no older than 12, disappeared on his way to deliver bread. His bike was found upright on the dirt road, still balanced, as though he had evaporated mid-pedal. That same night, his mother swore she heard him knocking at the door, begging to be let in. When she opened it, there was no one there, only the echo of her son's voice fading into the woods. And then came the fires again. Small at first, a haystack, a shed. But each blaze grew closer to the heart of town. By the time the townsfolk realized this was no accident, the old fear had already consumed them. They locked their doors, boarded their windows, and prayed not to be chosen. One night, as the townspeople gathered in the church to plan their next move, they heard a sound that froze them in their pews, the church bell, tolling on its own. The rope swayed violently, but no one stood beneath it. And with each ring, the candles inside the church flickered lower, until darkness swallowed the congregation whole. The truth was undeniable now, The curse wasn't tied to a place, a person, or even a family. It was tied to the land itself, an ancient hunger that could never be burned away. And this time, it wasn't just watching. It was choosing its next victim. The sheriff thought he had everything under control. The barn was surrounded, the deputies armed, the searchlights cutting through the night. But just when victory seemed within reach, the Weatherstones pulled off a move so bold, it felt ripped from a nightmare. As the lawmen approached the front of the barn, a deafening crack echoed through the valley, then flames erupted. The Weatherstones had doused the outer walls with kerosene and set their own hideout ablaze. Smoke roared upward, masking their movements, choking out the air. Deputies panicked, unsure if they should rush into the inferno or retreat. And in that moment of chaos, the Weatherstones slipped out through a hidden cellar door, vanishing into the darkness like phantoms. The blaze wasn't just destruction, it was a distraction, a psychological weapon. By the time the fire was under control, the barn was gone, reduced to ashes, and with it, the sheriff's hope of capturing the family. What the fire revealed, however, was worse: blackened bones buried under the floorboards, twisted iron shackles fused to the dirt, and scraps of clothing charred beyond recognition. Proof that the stories had been true all along. But here's the cruel twist: while the town finally had undeniable evidence of the horrors committed inside that barn, the Weatherstones themselves had slipped away, more dangerous than ever. They weren't just criminals anymore, they were legends, ghosts haunting the land, whispered about in fear. And as dawn broke over the valley, smoke still curling into the sky, one chilling question spread through the townsfolk like wildfire: if the Weatherstones could vanish right under the law's nose, where would they strike next? The morning after the barn fire, the town was no longer united, it was fractured. The charred remains of bones and shackles lay as undeniable proof that the Weatherstones had been monsters all along. But instead of rallying together, fear began tearing the community apart. Half the town demanded blood. They wanted a posse raised, dogs unleashed, and every hollow and mountain ridge scoured until the last Weatherstone was found and hung. They screamed for vengeance, furious that the family had escaped right under the sheriff's nose. The other half whispered a different story, one drenched in terror. They claimed that chasing the Weatherstones was suicide. These weren't just fugitives, they were something more, something untouchable. After all, hadn't they already outsmarted the sheriff, torched their own hideout, and vanished into the woods as if the earth had swallowed them whole? Some swore they'd seen shapes moving in the tree line that night, too tall, too fast, too unnatural to be human. Families began to turn on each other. Neighbors accused neighbors of secretly helping the Weatherstones. Shops closed early. Doors were barred. No one dared walk alone after dark. The town became its own prison, ruled not by law, but by fear. And at the center of it all was the sheriff, broken, humiliated, and desperate. He knew he had just one chance left. If he failed to bring them in now, the Weatherstones would forever remain shadows in the mountains, striking again whenever they pleased. So he made a decision that would split the town even further. He announced the largest manhunt the county had ever seen. But what he didn't reveal was this: deep down, he feared the Weatherstones weren't running at all. They were waiting. The manhunt began at dawn. The sheriff gathered every able-bodied man, handing out rifles, lanterns, and hounds that bayed at the scent of smoke still clinging to the hills. It was said to be the largest search party in the county's history, dozens of men marching into the Appalachian wilderness with fire in their eyes, determined to drag the Weatherstones out of the shadows. At first, the mood was fierce, almost righteous. Boots crunched over pine needles, axes hacked through brambles, and voices rang out across the ridges. But the mountains have a way of swallowing sound, twisting it and returning it in ways that unsettle even the bravest. Before long, the laughter and bravado faded into silence. The dogs, once eager, grew restless. They would catch a trail, howl wildly, and then stop. Dead, tails tucked, refusing to go further. Some handlers cursed and yanked them forward, but others swore the animals knew something men did not. Then came the signs. A tree marked with a crude carving of an eye. A circle of stones left in the middle of a clearing, still warm from a fire that had burned only hours before. Blood smeared across bark, not in the spray of a wound, but painted there deliberately, like a warning. The posse looked at one another, unease growing. Night fell faster than it should have. Lanterns flickered, shadows stretched unnaturally long, and whispers moved through the trees like voices carried on the wind. Some swore they heard footsteps trailing them, always just out of sight. Others claimed they saw figures darting between the trees, silent and watching. By the second day, the first group of men turned back. By the third, more followed, muttering that this wasn't a manhunt at all, it was a walk straight into a trap. But the sheriff pressed on, teeth clenched, every step fueled by his own obsession. Because deep down, he knew the truth, the Weatherstones weren't running. They were hunting. The night the walls began to whisper was the night the town finally lost its silence. For decades, the Callahan family's name had been spoken in hushed tones across Tennessee. But in 1907, something shifted. Rumors that had once been treated as ghost stories began crawling into official records, newspaper columns, and the mouths of those who once swore loyalty. It was no longer a tale to be buried, it was evidence that refused to stay hidden. A group of miners who worked near the old Callahan property swore they heard screams echoing through the abandoned barn. They told their foreman, who laughed it off, saying it was just the wind. But then, the sound didn't stop. For 3 nights straight, the workers reported the same blood-curdling cries. And on the 4th night, one of the miners never came back. The disappearance ripped through the community like a wildfire. For the first time, the town couldn't ignore it. Authorities launched a quiet investigation, but the deeper they dug, the more disturbing it became. Journals hidden beneath floorboards, letters never meant to be found, and family Bibles with entire pages ripped out. Each clue suggested that the Callahans hadn't just been an isolated nightmare, they had been part of something larger. The most chilling discovery wasn't bones in the ground or blood on the walls. It was a ledger. A carefully written book tracking dates, initials, and symbols. On its last page, one word was carved deeper than ink could ever sink: harvest. No one knew what it meant. Was it a code? A ritual? A warning? Theories swirled, some said it referred to crops, others whispered about something far darker, a cycle of disappearances that matched harvest seasons year after year. And then came the boldest whisper of all, one that would shake the entire investigation. A local priest claimed he had seen that same ledger before, in a different town, tied to a different family. Suddenly, the Callahans weren't just a cursed bloodline. They were the visible tip of something sprawling, something that crossed counties and generations. If the Callahans weren't acting alone, then who, or what, was pulling the strings? And how many towns across Appalachia had been hiding the same bloody secret? The town had finally begun to settle after years of whispers and shadows, but just when people thought the nightmare had ended, another secret surfaced. It started quietly, almost too quietly, an old storage trunk discovered in the attic of a decaying farmhouse, left behind by a family who fled years earlier. The dust-covered chest was locked, its iron hinges rusted with age, but curiosity pried it open. Inside were stacks of faded letters, each one sealed in crimson wax, and each bearing a name that no one in the town dared to say aloud. The first letter wasn't just a memory, it was a warning. It spoke of debts owed not in money, but in silence. It hinted at bargains struck behind closed doors, promises that if broken, would tear apart families from the inside. The deeper they read, the more disturbing it became. Some letters mentioned disappearances long thought to be accidents, men vanishing near the river, women never returning from late-night errands, children lost in the woods. But here, in black ink and trembling handwriting, was something far more sinister. They weren't accidents. They were offerings. That revelation hit the community like a sledgehammer. People wanted to believe the feud was over, that the darkness had passed. But this trunk of letters suggested it was never about land, pride, or revenge, it was about something far older, a pact stretching back generations. And if that was true, then every grave dug in the hills wasn't the result of rage, it was the fulfillment of a bargain. Then came the twist no one expected. One of the letters was dated not from decades ago, but from only 5 years earlier. This wasn't history, it was recent. Someone had been keeping the pact alive, long after everyone thought it had died. The realization was chilling. The feud hadn't ended, it had simply gone underground. The killers weren't gone, they were hidden, living among them. As news spread, paranoia gripped the town. Every neighbor became a suspect, every handshake a question. Families who had once gathered at each other's tables now locked their doors at night, whispering about who might still be tied to the pact. But the most shocking part was yet to come. Inside one final envelope was a map, drawn crudely, but unmistakable. It marked a location deep in the woods, a place locals had always avoided. And scrawled across the bottom of that map were 6 words that froze every soul who read them: the debt is not yet paid. The town had thought its story of blood and betrayal was over. But this message made one thing clear: the past wasn't finished with them. And the most dangerous chapter hadn't even begun. The Weatherstones believed they had mastered the art of deception, burying truth beneath lies, silencing those who questioned, and keeping entire counties under their thumb. But what if I told you the greatest betrayal didn't come from strangers, but from one of their own? In the early 1900s, rumors began swirling in neighboring states about a Weatherstone cousin who had vanished from the Appalachian stronghold. For years, no one spoke his name inside the clan. Families whispered he was dead, taken by the hills. But then, out of nowhere, he resurfaced. And he didn't come back quietly. He came back with evidence. This cousin had fled, carrying with him a black ledger filled with numbers, names, and coded entries that detailed the Weatherstones' network of crimes, illegal land deals, hidden graves, and payoffs to sheriffs. At first, people thought it was just tall tales. But then came the every time he revealed a name from the book, another unsolved disappearance suddenly made sense. Yet here's the twist: the cousin wasn't a hero. He wasn't doing this out of justice. He was doing it out of revenge. He had once been beaten nearly to death by his own kin for questioning their leadership. He survived, barely, and now he wanted payback. His revelations weren't designed to save lives, they were designed to burn the entire family empire to the ground. The townsfolk didn't know what to do. On one side, they had the Weatherstones, terrifying, ruthless, and deeply entrenched in their land. On the other, a bitter insider exposing secrets that could dismantle them all. Who do you trust when the only people speaking the truth are motivated by vengeance? The mini twist came when the cousin struck a deal with outsiders, industrial men who wanted Appalachian land for coal. He traded Weatherstone secrets in exchange for wealth and protection. Overnight, the feud shifted from family versus law to family versus industry, and that made the stakes even deadlier. And here's the part no one expected: the cousin didn't survive his own revenge. Just weeks after handing over the ledger, he disappeared once more. Some claimed he fled with his new fortune. Others whispered the Weatherstones found him and erased him for good. But a chilling third possibility remains, that the very outsiders he trusted silenced him to keep the land deals quiet. What's undeniable is this: after his betrayal, the Weatherstones were never the same. Suspicion tore through their ranks, alliances crumbled, and the once mighty family empire began to fracture from within. It wasn't lawmen or outsiders that weakened them first, it was their own bloodline, cracking under the weight of secrets too heavy to carry. And the darkest question of all? If betrayal from within could destroy the Weatherstones, how many more families across Appalachia suffered the exact same fate, in silence, leaving only whispers and unmarked graves behind? The community thought the storm was over. Ezekiel was gone, the farm was abandoned, and the whispers of horror slowly faded into silence. But silence, in this town, was never peace, it was a warning. Because beneath the ashes of what Ezekiel left behind, something darker was still alive. When the last raid was over, officials sealed the farm. Doors locked. Windows boarded. Locals were told to forget it, to never step near the cursed soil again. And most obeyed, except a few teenagers who couldn't resist the thrill of sneaking into a forbidden place. They thought they'd find dust and broken furniture, what they found instead nearly shattered them. The first time they pried open the back door, the air reeked of rot. The floorboards creaked like they were groaning under a weight no one could see. The boys laughed nervously, daring each other to keep going. But when they reached the cellar, they froze. Carved into the walls were fresh marks, not decades old, but recent. Someone had been there. The cellar wasn't empty. Tattered blankets lay in a corner, still warm as if someone had just left. On the dirt floor sat a half-burned candle, wax still dripping. That's when one boy whispered, "He's still here." They bolted, never speaking of it again. But their story spread, feeding the town's oldest fear: Ezekiel might not have died. He might have returned. And then the livestock started vanishing. First, a chicken coop torn apart. Then a farmer's dog, found mutilated on the edge of the woods. Parents locked their doors tighter than ever, but at night, people swore they saw lanterns flickering between the trees where no lantern should be. It was as if the farm itself refused to stay buried. But here's the real twist: years later, when authorities decided to tear down the structure once and for all, they uncovered something no one expected. Buried beneath the barn's foundations was a sealed wooden chest. Inside were journals, written not by Ezekiel, but by his followers. Pages filled with devotion, rituals, and plans for the return. One line sent chills down investigators' spines. "The shepherd will rise again when silence is loudest, and his flock most blind." Suddenly, the disappearances, the flickering lights, the rumors, it all seemed less like folklore and more like prophecy. Was it possible that Ezekiel's legacy didn't die with him? Or worse, was someone actively carrying it forward? The farm was demolished. Concrete poured over the land to erase it forever. But even now, travelers claim that when the wind is heavy, you can hear faint chanting near the site. Some say it's just imagination. Others believe it's Ezekiel's followers, still waiting, still faithful, still watching. Because evil doesn't always die, it hides, it waits, and when you least expect it, it comes knocking again. The investigators thought they had finally reached the bottom of the story. They had files, testimonies, even fragments of ledgers showing where the missing money went. The town's silence had been broken, and the truth seemed undeniable. But then, something strange happened. Documents that had been carefully catalogued began to vanish. Witnesses who were once willing to talk suddenly claimed they remembered nothing. Even the courthouse where evidence was stored suffered a mysterious fire, destroying half of the archive. It was as if the past itself was fighting back, refusing to let the truth escape. For decades, survivors had whispered that the family's reach didn't end with the land they owned or the workers they exploited. It went higher, far beyond what ordinary people could imagine. There were rumors of judges who owed favors, politicians who had accepted silent donations, and doctors who had been bribed to falsify death records. If even a fraction of it were true, the conspiracy was much larger than anyone dared to believe. One investigator, who had devoted his life to uncovering the story, left behind a single chilling note before he vanished: "You think it was just a family? No. It was a system." That single line changed everything. The public no longer viewed the crimes as isolated acts of greed or violence. They began to suspect they were looking at only the tip of an iceberg, a hidden structure of power that had thrived in silence for generations. The enemy wasn't just the guilty family, it was the entire web of people who had protected them. Suddenly, the feud was no longer about revenge, pride, or bloodlines. It became a story about truth itself, about whether a community could ever break free from the chains of its own silence. The more journalists, historians, and truth-seekers dug, the more resistance they faced. And yet, each fragment of truth that survived gave shape to a darker, more haunting picture, a story that was bigger than a family, bigger than a town, and maybe even bigger than history wanted anyone to know. The real horror was not just in what had been done, but in how easily it could all be erased. And that leads us to the most unsettling question of all: if the truth of this feud could be buried so thoroughly, how many other stories just like it are still hidden in the shadows, waiting to be uncovered, or waiting to be burned away forever? The storm had passed, but the scars it left behind would never heal. For years, the tale of the Weatherstones remained buried in whispers, old photographs, and rotting wooden beams of abandoned cabins. Locals avoided the ruins, claiming that on stormy nights you could still hear the chains rattling in the fields and the faint cries of those who vanished. What had begun as a simple feud over land had transformed into a generational curse, pulling in outsiders, corrupt sheriffs, and entire towns into its bloody web. The chilling part? It never really ended. After the supposed last sighting of the Weatherstones in the 1920s, reports kept surfacing in Appalachian archives, unexplained disappearances, families who suddenly abandoned their homes, and lone wanderers who claimed to stumble across hidden farmsteads in the mountains where torches still burned at night. Historians dismissed these stories as folklore. But folklore has a dangerous habit, sometimes it bleeds into reality. One archivist, digging through courthouse records in the 1970s, uncovered something shocking: dozens of missing persons reports across 12 different counties, all filed between 1870 and 1940. Each one had a chilling detail in common: the victim's last known location was always a community where families carrying the Weatherstone surname had quietly settled. Coincidence? Or a shadow network that stretched far beyond the mountains of West Virginia and Kentucky? Even now, people who research too deeply into the case describe strange encounters. Emails that vanish, files that get corrupted, and once friendly locals who suddenly refuse to speak another word. It's as if the very story itself is cursed, a reminder that some truths were never meant to surface. But here's the haunting twist: in 2019, a hiker exploring a restricted section of Appalachian forest uploaded photos to an online forum. Among the moss-covered ruins, he found what looked like freshly carved wooden stakes and a crude symbol burned into the trees. Hours later, his posts were mysteriously deleted, and his account vanished. He was never heard from again. So, the question lingers: did the Weatherstones truly disappear, or did they simply scatter, embedding themselves in the cracks of forgotten America? Maybe their story isn't history at all, maybe it's still unfolding. And perhaps the scariest part? The same hills where the feud once raged are still there, silent, waiting, watching. Because some families don't die, they endure. The wind howled through the hollow valley as if the land itself carried a memory it refused to bury. People thought the feud had died with the last gunshot, the final grave, the closing of a bloody chapter. But what if I told you, the story never truly ended? In 1920, decades after the Hatfields and McCoys supposedly laid their guns down, a chilling event shook the descendants who tried desperately to escape the shadow of their ancestors. A forgotten cabin, hidden deep in the Kentucky woods, was discovered by hunters. Inside were rusted rifles still loaded, blood-stained ledgers, and a locked chest that carried a name scorched into the wood: McCoy. No one ever admitted who owned it, or why it was left to rot. Some swore it was the hideout of a survivor who refused to surrender, a man who kept planning revenge long after the feud was declared over. When researchers later studied the chest, they found a small stack of letters. These weren't ordinary letters, they were threats. But not from a Hatfield or a McCoy. They came from outsiders, neighboring families who had used the chaos of the feud to settle their own grudges under the cover of Hatfield-McCoy violence. Which means, the bloodshed may have never been entirely theirs. The feud became a mask, a convenient cloak for darker games played by those who never made it into the history books. Imagine that, two families locked in a cycle of vengeance, but the real spark sometimes came from strangers in the shadows. That's the cruelest cut of all. While the Hatfields and McCoys destroyed one another, hidden hands may have been fanning the flames. But the most unsettling detail wasn't in the chest, it was in the ground. A mile from the cabin, beneath a collapsed well, bones were discovered. Not buried, not marked, just dumped. They weren't Hatfield or McCoy remains. They belonged to drifters, men and women who had vanished during the height of the feud. Their lives swallowed up, their deaths blamed on the endless war. Innocents, caught in the storm, erased so neatly that for generations no one even asked where they'd gone. So when we say the feud ended in the late 1800s, maybe that's a lie we tell ourselves. Because if ghosts can linger in letters, in bones, in whispers through forgotten cabins, then the truth is darker: the feud never really ended, it just changed its shape. And maybe, just maybe, every time you hear the wind howl in those Appalachian hollows, it isn't the weather at all. It's the last warning from a war that still hasn't finished speaking.